Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you are watching Perspective. On the show today, we are going to discuss a development of immense strategic and economic significance, the ongoing negotiations between India and the European Union on a comprehensive free trade agreement. The 11th round of talks on the proposed agreement concluded on the 16th of May. Both sides are likely to conclude the agreement in two phases on account of the uncertain global trade environment, particularly due to the US tariff actions under President Donald Trump. Issues where there is convergence would be included in the first part of the agreement. The second part is expected to conclude by the end of this year. Remember, in February this year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen had agreed to seal a much-awaited free trade deal by the end of 2025. The European Commission President, in fact, had also said that the agreement would be the largest deal of its kind anywhere in the world. So what is the progress made in the negotiations since talks resumed in 2022? What are the sticking points that remain for both sides? And what is the path forward in the agreement, which is to be finalized by the end of the year? These are some crucial aspects we will delve into with distinguished guests who are joining us. I'm pleased to welcome on the program Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, former Ambassador of India to Germany, Dr. Sheetal Sharma, Associate Professor, Center for European Studies, School of International Studies, JNU, and Mr. Dilip Mitra Chenoy, former Secretary General, FICCI. So I welcome all our distinguished panelists on this edition of Perspective. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. Given the recent 11th round of talks and reports suggesting that we are going to conclude the agreement in two phases, what signs of progress do you see both sides making on this comprehensive free trade agreement?
Thank you, Tina, for having me on the show. So I think, first of all, there are two important things. One, the political commitment, as you mentioned, between Prime Minister Modi and EU President Ursula von der Leyen, that within 2025, an FTA should be concluded. So, come what may, given this commitment by the leaders, I think some form of the FTA is bound to be concluded within this year. The second, the geopolitical situation in the world is perhaps today the most conducive for a long-standing India-EU FTA, which never seemed to see the end of the day. So this situation, where the dealing with Russia, dealing with China, dealing with the United States is causing Europe concern, and they are looking at a big market like India. So therefore, it is hoped that they would be more flexible in coming to deal with us in a conclusive manner. However, whether they then get bogged down in traditional EU inflexibilities, non-trade barriers, the love for climate issues, that all I think is very open. I would like to say that we were supposed to do three agreements: the FTA, the investment agreement, and the geographical indicators. I personally believe that it is the investment agreement which is most important for India. But we seem to be pursuing the FTA, which is most important for the EU. So I think we need to do some parallel work, lest once again in our negotiating strategy, the investment aspect gets put into second place. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Sharma, what are your thoughts? How would you assess the negotiation trajectory so far, at least since the talks have resumed since 2022? Do you see signs that both sides are now more flexible in terms of agreeing to some of the sticking points that remained because of which the talks were stalled for so long?
Tina, certainly the geopolitical changes are bringing both of us together, and there are compulsions as well from both the sides. Now, if we plot once again this into the entire geopolitical situation, once again we have been having shocks sent from United States of America to rest of the world. There has been an open tariff war, although of course there has been a restraint on it, say for example putting it on hold for 3 months with China or with EU, certain things like that. But certainly the environment is ripe and conducive conducive to conclude this FTA, because this is not just the Trump era, which was, a decisive factor. It has been hanging for a long period of time. But the problem emerges from the fact that, as Ambassador Saab was also mentioning about the inflexibility of the EU mechanism, because there are three levels at which we have to see that how these competencies unfold and become sometimes a roadblock in the process of negotiating with India. EU operates at one level with exclusive competencies, at the another one with the shared competencies with the member states, and the third one is exclusively of the member states. So there are different compartments within that, and here they deal with Union of India as a consolidated entity. So that is why one part of it is the problem that emerges from the EU competencies. The other part is with India as well, in the sense that India has good trade ties with bilateral member states. Say, for example, with France, with Germany, UK out of picture now, but anyhow, we have concluded a good FTA with United Kingdom as well. So the problem occurs that we deal with bilaterally with member states and at the same time with EU, and EU itself further divided at three levels. So there are many crisscross arrows which needs to be tackled. Number two, once again, this has to be done at three levels. One being the trade, the second one investment, and the third one geographical indicators. Now with trade, this is pretty straightforward that we have our concerns, they have their own concerns. With investment, the environment has to be made conducive, once again welcoming from red tape to red carpet, how much transit we can make in that area. And geographical indicators, we are far behind in terms of being on the same page. So that is why many of the things have to be ironed out, but then they can be taken up in stages and chapter wise, so that it becomes easy for negotiators also to come on the similar page, on similar lines, and at the same time address the political will, that by end of the year, both the political leaders or the leadership has shown some indications of being able to reach to the stage. So this has to be culminated, given the political will now.
Okay, before we proceed to Mr. Chinoy and get the industry perspective, Dr. Sharma, a related question, since you mentioned the India-UK deal as well. If we compare it to the India-UK negotiations, why are the India-EU talks so complex and slow? It's important for us to understand that first, then we can perhaps discuss the complexities and the sticking points in the next round of questions.
Tina, I would say that India-UK negotiations were easier as compared to India-EU, once again because of the institutional architecture of the European Union. In India-UK deal particularly, it has been a mixed bag. We cannot say that it has been totally in favor of India or in UK, because there have been some areas which were a win-win situation for both the countries, or a win-lose for the respective ones. So India-UK in 3.5 years post-Brexit, UK was also in such a situation where, because of post-COVID recovery, because of divorce from UK, from the European Union, and many other issues, not having EU as a market now, as a single market, but dealing with EU, European Union, as a third country. So this was difficult, but UK and India FTA progressed in the right direction, culminated in 3.5 years of negotiation. That's good. But then we have to see that how many of the things which have been signed, they will unfold over a period of time, and how trust plays an important role between the two entities. With EU, the things change because we are dealing with a 27 member state bloc, and many of the decisions which are EU competencies have to be ratified by 27 member states. So this is where sometimes the individual and the multilateral negotiations, they crisscross each other and create roadblocks, and that is why the EU institutional mechanism, which is very strong on regulatory mechanisms and the kind of non-tariff barriers which are in the way of coming up to the common standards of tariff or non-tariff barriers, this is something which is a bit difficult, but I won't say this is impossible to achieve, given the intentions of both on the right direction, and to achieve this within a given time frame. I think it would be culminated very soon. If very soon means by end of the year, or maybe a couple of months more.
Okay, let's hope. Mr. Chinoy, the fact that this agreement opens up opportunities, there are also concerns that we will discuss in due course of the program. So let me talk about the opportunities first. From the industry's perspective, what are the major opportunities that this agreement, the India-EU FTA, is going to open up for India if the agreement sees the light of the day by the end of the year?
So thank you, Tina, for having me on the show. If you were to look at the discussion so far, And if you take the UK FTA as a model, right? So the first thing what you see about the next steps is at least we will break this up into two parts. We will look at where there's agreement and have a phase one of the agreement, and maybe later on look at some of the sticking points. We'll actually have an early harvest like we did, let's say, many years ago with the ASEAN, or recently with Australia, and what we're also looking at the US. If I were to look at the opportunities, right, it is all a comparative opportunity. Earlier we used to have a generalized GSP tariff with EU, but then that has gone away. We are onto the MFN route now. And therefore, if you look at the sectors, and I'll just take like 2 or 3 or 4 sectors. The first is textiles and ready-made garments. I mean, if we have close to 9 to 10% of tariff with the EU, where our competitors like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Turkey have preferential EU access here. So if you look at that going forward, if we are able to get a deal which is in line with what we want, then this is really an opportunity that we can look at. And EU, while we are challenged by their, as Ambassador Singh mentioned about their focus on environment, but if you look at sustainability and ethically produced textiles from India, that could be an opportunity. The second area is pharmaceuticals. Here we'll have to bridge the gap of both the regulation and tariffs. And there's also a sticky point in pharmaceuticals, which is the evergreening of patents, which is a challenge. But we can look at joint R&D and contract manufacturing and take advantage of our generic and biosimilar manufacturing in India. The third area again is steel and petroleum products. Steel is a major item here. Again, there we might have the challenges of environment, but then we have an opportunity. We could make the tariff reductions could make Indian exports more attractive, and we could open up a different market in the EU. The fourth area is a bilateral area because, as Professor Sharma mentioned, that, we have different deals with different of the 27 states. But for some of these states, we could actually manufacture and export electrical machinery and electronics and look at, the advantage of lower tariffs and also enhanced exports there. We could also, as Ambassador Singh mentioned, that we're doing the bilateral investment treaty, and if we can actually do that, greater European investments into the Indian electronics sector, and in fact, most of the other sectors that we are wanting to do greater maturing in. So just, these are 4 of the sectors which we could have advantage in.
Sure. Let me go across to Ambassador Singh, and because Ambassador, there is bound to be a comparative analysis. The India-UK FTA has happened recently. There is a comparative lens that we are looking at the India-EU deal also. Help us understand what were the obstacles back then when the talks between India and EU were stalled? What kind of progress have been made, particularly on those factors? And in context of the India-UK deal, what were the factors on which we progressed rapidly, especially on the movement of professionals? Can that not be replicated in the India-EU context as well?
So, the EU and UK were in a race as to who would defreeze the FTA with India first, and the UK seems to have won. But the issues are largely the same because for many years the UK negotiated with India through the EU and were frankly an impediment, a bigger impediment than many other countries. So it's odd that in the EU they were an impediment. Outside the EU, they go ahead and sign an agreement. It also shows that we are now more flexible. You made very important points. We need investment and we need free movement of professionals. But I put it to you that frankly, for these two things, you don't need the EU. Investment rules are actually, well, you need EU-wide treaty, but unlike the FTA, lots of investment rules are actually made by European countries themselves. Where migration is concerned and professional movement is concerned, this is entirely within the remit of individual countries who are EU members. That is why you see with Germany, France, with many others, India has already been working on mobility and migration agreements without waiting for an FTA from the EU. So if we are able to solve two of our major concerns, then frankly, what are we looking at in the FTA? There is the issue of data security. Now, because of data security, many Indian IT companies invested in the EU and stopped championing the India-EU FTA, which was taking so long. Now the EU says that their data should only be stored there, while we say what you do with that should be stored in India. And that remains a contentious point. The other one is the CBAM, that is the carbon tax and environmental regulation, which while opening up trade could yet add 20 to 35% on goods which the European Union considers as high carbon goods. So this is frankly another non-tariff barrier on India. Now, when you compare the India-UK, you will find that tariffs on automobiles and alcoholic beverages are something that the UK wanted reduced and the EU also wants to reduce. The UK wants to sell more whiskey, the EU wants to sell more wine. The market in India is the same. So, like we seem to have given a graduated reduction in duty on alcohol and automobiles to the UK, we may perhaps give it to European Union as well. But the problem is that the European Union wants their big cars to be considered for duty purposes like small cars. This argument, when I was in Germany, I could never understand. And they felt that why could I not understand it? After all, a BMW and a Maruti should be taxed the same way. Odd logic, no? But the EU thinks this is logic. So I personally think Indian negotiators will have to pull a rabbit out of their hats to convince me that the FTA was in our favor. I think the jury on the FTA with the UK is yet not out because nobody quite knows precisely what was said.
Okay,
so
Dr.
I
Sharma.
think the benefits to India, are they in the FTA or are they assurances outside the FTA, like mobility, like investment, like taking away the carbon tax? This is not clear to me.
So I think,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Sharma, that brings us to a very important and critical question at this time is that what can be done now in order to break the deadlock in the next round? So what we understand is tariff asymmetries, sustainability demands still remain contentious. Which of these do you think will be deal breakers, which can be resolved in the next round or maybe the future rounds that will take place?
Tina, one thing very important is to break the deadlock and achieve the deadlines. One important thing is that. But the second important thing is that we must not rush into seeing the deal through by ignoring the context in which the two, I would say, entities operate. Say, for example, one is the European Union, quite advanced, developed with high level and high standards of living, high per capita income. At the same time, compare it with India. In the context of India-UK FTA, it was mentioned that we have to understand the differences in the two societies and two contexts. This applies, the same logic applies to EU as well. As the automobile sector was mentioned by the ambassadors, see, there are three kinds of segment, the lower, the mid and the high segment. And there has to be a difference between how you tax the three segments. But at the same time, there's another contentious issue about the dairy and agricultural products. Now, if in case we have a market flooded with products which are coming from the West to Indian market is huge. This is going to have a decisive impact upon the agricultural community here in India.
Right.
Now, we have to see how do we cater to the interest, how do we protect the interest of the farmers or the constituencies back home. And this is something which has been contentious for a long period of time. And the third factor, which is about geographical indicators, we are nowhere close to any of the Western countries or the developed world in terms of, having achieved at least a status where we can comfortably and convincingly say that we have GI indicators and the products are being sold on that name. Although, of course, India has a large potential in the area, but it remains unexplored and untapped. So the issue is about that India is a lucrative market, India is a big market, India needs to come up to the standards, but there are some things which are requiring a domestic course correction. Say, for example, coming up with the standards of or improving the standards of the project, having products having more competitive advantage or edges as compared to rest of the countries. So these are the things where we need to improve our standards or delivery of products, at the same time services sector, which is our forte. But along with that, we have to see that what are we doing with FDA, particularly with trades in goods, something which is not going to hamper the interest of Indian constituencies. Second, in investment, we have to make the environment welcoming and do away with the kind of red tape. Say, for example, in procurement, India opened up some sectors for central government procurement and more, a large number of areas in which UK can now be a bidder, but how is it going to unfold? Are we going to meet, or are they going to meet the regulatory standards here? Forget about the regulatory standards of the European Union. Now, the third is about the non-tariff barriers which EU imposes on our products, but this is not going to be a competitive advantage for us. It is going to be a hindrance or barrier which has been holding the negotiations for a long period of time. So, seeing all these gamut of actors and factors, it is very wise for us to negotiate in different sectors and in different spheres with different kind of intention and understand the differences. Once again, I would say the differences and the interest of the community has to be protected rather than just rushing through to meet deadlines. Yes, of course, the political leadership has indicated that there can be some flexibility, but how flexible will that be? Flexibility, that flexibility will be. The degree has to be decided in the interest of, at least I would say, being from Indian side, that we have to look for our own interest rather than going and succumbing to the pressures that come from the European
Absolutely.
Union.
So the points that you've made leads me to the next question, Mr. Chinoy. How prepared is the Indian industry to compete on regulatory standards, especially when we talk of sectors like the pharmaceutical, textiles, digital services? So from the Indian context, how prepared are we? What should we be prioritizing in the times to come to prepare our market, or to prepare ourselves for an EU FTA ready market?
So, Tina, if you look at the opportunities that I talked about earlier, and some of the points that Professor Sharma has made, I think for companies in India, we have to look at 3 or 4 things in the European Union, and if the negotiations could address this in some manner, so if I look at the pharma sector, right, and intellectual property rights. So one of the big challenges for India is if EU push for a TRIPS plus provision, which may actually impact India's generic pharma industry. And if you look at the various enforcements of obligations that they have, may burden MSMEs and really startups in the intellectual property right area. So I think Indian firms need to gear up to be able to understand what are the various types of non-tariff barriers and what are the obligations, like Ambassador mentioned under CBAM, which is the carbon border tax adjustment mechanism. So that is one set of issues. The other set of issues relate to compliance in the EU of, let's say, CE markings, sustainability. And for Indian firms in the different sectors, especially MSMEs that are exporting, the cost of compliance may go up, and therefore it would be a challenge for them to compete with companies and firms that are already complying and have a lower duty compared to us. The third area is, it relates to, of course, the digital trade and data governance, which you had talked about. And I think here there is an opportunity to, for cooperation in, let's say, digital services, cybersecurity, and AI. Especially AI would be of interest to the EU because they believe they have lost out to, let's say, the US in this space. So if India and EU collaborate, it could lead to a very positive outcome. But again, the EU data protection requirements like the GDPR may be difficult for a lot of small and medium Indian companies to look at, and we need kind of alignment between the Indian, rules and things in India, really. So I think we have to look at, 3 or 4 things strategically, where we look at how do we safeguard sensitive sectors like, Professor Sharma mentioned. How do we look at building the supply chain and getting European firms to invest here and look at, like SPS and technical barriers to trade are addressed with some kind of mutual recognition going forward. And then in the other areas which we are looking at, non-tariff barriers, especially, we need to be able to educate and work with our small and medium industries to ensure that they are compliant. So there'll be a lot of action which will be required in India. And also, I think, therefore, in areas where these are not sensitive and where only tariff is an issue, then possibly we'll see those sectors emerging in the early harvest scheme, and where the SPS and sustainability and non-tariff barriers, etc., are a challenge. We'll actually see that coming up a bit later in the year going forward.
So there are certainly opportunities, Ambassador, for both sides, but there are also challenges, as we've discussed, and which led to the talks being stalled as well. Then we restarted the talks back in 2022. 11th round of talks have just concluded. The question here is, what would a balanced or mutually beneficial agreement look like? What should India concede? What it must protect? Are being negotiated in the multiple rounds of talks that are happening. But if we are to talk about a path forward, we definitely want a deal to happen. There has been commitment at the highest level. What can be done between now and the next round of talks to try and break the deadlock on some of these contentious issues, so that we are not back to square one, so that these contentious issues do not bring us to the situation we were in 2013?
Tina, these talks have been going on for 15 years. Do you know that the entrenched bureaucracies in Europe detest negotiating with India? Because they think we are obdurate, and we think the same about them. So at the bureaucratic level, you are not going to get any breakthrough, because these are very hard people on both sides. Commerce Secretary has said after the last round that we are looking for early harvest. I think Dilip has mentioned early harvest. Our experience of early harvest has not been a good one. With ASEAN, with Thailand, we did not seem to get much out of that. So to answer your question, the first litmus test for us is what is in it for us even at the early harvest stage. I think clear gains for India need to be articulated and shown. The clear gains for Europe, I think, are very evident. But we need to say what we are gaining. Will our trade jump, our exports jump from 98 billion to 300 billion? Is that feasible in 5 years? Can that happen? Will they open their markets that much? Are our companies competent to triple their exports to Europe? I think these are the questions we need to look at. And then, of course, comes investment. If they want more automobiles to be sold here, they must invest more in automobiles here to reduce the cost. You simply can't say that the Indian tax system must subsidize the high cost of European cars when they can actually produce them in India at lower cost, but they are not competitive. Because Japanese cars are not allowing European cars to dominate the Indian market. So, do you think that simply bringing them in from Europe will increase their market share? We will lose tax, certainly. But will it increase their market share? I'm not so certain. So, I think clear victory for India, clear determinant for the Indian economy at this stage, leading to Viksit Bharat 47, is the call of the hour in 2025.
So I think that sums it up, that our negotiators perhaps are navigating through complex terrains of the India-EU FTA. But let's hope that the path ahead with pragmatism, with persistent dialogue, and of course there is political will, that is something that we already discussed in the program, will yield to favorable results for both sides. With that, we'll have to wrap up the conversation. Thank you, Ambassador Singh, Mr. Chinoy and Dr. Sharma, for your valuable time and your valuable insights on this very important subject, the India-EU FTA agreement, which both sides want to conclude by the end of the year. But given the complexities, there will for now be multiple rounds of talks wherein both sides will try and find a deadlock to some of these contentious issues that we've discussed in the program. Thank you once again to all our guests, and thank you once again, viewers, for your time as well.